dread. We admire those who push themselves, those who seem to possess a relentless internal drive, and yet we often view their behavior as foreign, almost superhuman. We assume they were born with some kind of innate passion or discipline that the rest of us were simply not endowed with. But the reality is different. The capacity to engage in hard work, sustained, focused effort over time, is not something you are born with. It's something you can train. Like any other system in the body, the brain can be rewired, optimized, and shaped by the stimuli it's exposed to. And in this case, that stimulus is effort itself. The first step in training your brain to love hard work is understanding how effort and reward are processed neurologically. At the core of this lies a molecule you've probably heard of, dopamine. Dopamine is commonly associated with pleasure, but more accurately, it's the molecule of motivation, anticipation, and pursuit. What's crucial to understand is that dopamine doesn't just spike when you achieve something, it also spikes, and perhaps more powerfully, during the process of working toward a goal. And herein lies the key to transforming your relationship with hard work. Most people mistake dopamine as something that comes at the finish line, when you get the raise, win the medal, cross the marathon's end. But when we look closely at the neuroscience, we find that the more you associate dopamine release with the effort itself, with the climb rather than the summit, the more likely you are to engage in hard work voluntarily, consistently, and even joyfully. This isn't abstract, it's hardwired. Let me give you a concrete example. In laboratory studies with rodents, animals were given the option to press a lever to get a food reward. Some of the levers required more presses, more effort. Remarkably, when dopamine was artificially enhanced, the rodents would choose the harder lever, the one that required more effort, because the act of working became more intrinsically rewarding. In humans, we see a similar pattern. When people mentally frame effort as a signal of progress, their brains begin to shift from avoidance to approach behavior. They start to seek out the challenge because the neurochemical environment is now reinforcing effort, not just success. So how do we get there? How do you, in your daily life, begin to teach your brain to enjoy the process rather than just the outcome? It starts with internal framing. This might sound like a psychological trick, but in fact, it creates a real neurochemical shift. The way you talk to yourself during effort, the internal narrative you deploy when something is hard determines whether your brain classifies that effort as threat or opportunity. If you tell yourself, this is hard, but this is where the growth happens, or this strain means I'm getting stronger, your brain begins to release more dopamine during the work, not just after it. Over time, this wiring becomes more efficient. You no longer have to convince yourself. The association becomes automatic. Your brain starts to expect reward from the work itself. You can think of it like resistance training, but for your neurochemistry. Each time you push through the initial discomfort, each time you override the urge to quit, you're not just achieving something externally. You're reshaping how your brain processes effort. You are training it to release the very chemicals that will motivate you to return to the task again. In this way, hard work becomes a self-reinforcing loop. Let's be clear, this doesn't mean it becomes easy. Loving hard work is not the same as always feeling comfortable. In fact, part of the adaptation is learning to experience discomfort differently. You begin to decouple discomfort from suffering. Discomfort becomes data. It tells you that you're in the zone of growth. The key is to get just outside your comfort zone, not so far that your nervous system shuts down, but far enough that adaptation is required. In neuroscience, we call this the zone of neuroplasticity, the sweet spot where the brain is most likely to change in response to experience. You can actually influence the threshold at which effort triggers a stress response. By gradually increasing the intensity or duration of your work sessions while staying mentally engaged and physiologically calm, you teach your system that higher levels of effort are not threatening. This is critical. When your brain no longer views effort as something to be avoided, but rather as a trigger for reward, you'll start seeking it out naturally. That's when the love of hard work emerges, not as a concept, but as a biological truth. There's another dimension here that's essential. Train focus, you increase your brain's ability to derive satisfaction from single task attention. And this is deeply connected to hard work. Sustained attention, whether on a book, a spreadsheet, a workout, or a difficult conversation, is not just a mental skill. It's a trainable form of endurance. And like all forms of endurance, It improves with progressive overload. Start with shorter bouts of deep work, remove distractions, and extend those bouts over time. As you do, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision making, planning, and sustained focus, becomes more efficient. And this efficiency, too, is rewarding. You begin to experience more flow, more moments where time disappears, and all that remains is the task. One powerful way to reinforce this is through deliberate recovery. Hard work is not sustainable if it's constant, but recovery, when used properly, doesn't just recharge the body. It reinforces the brain's association between effort and pleasure. When you work hard and then recover deeply, whether through sleep, non-sleep deep rest, or mindful breathing, you're creating a binary signal: work equals effort plus restoration. The nervous system learns that stress is not a permanent state, but part of a cycle. This allows you to lean harder into work without fear of burnout. A lot of people wait for motivation before taking action, but that's a misunderstanding of how the system actually works. In truth, action often precedes motivation. The very act of engaging in hard work, even when you don't feel like it, can trigger the dopamine release that leads to motivation. In other words, if you move first, the chemistry will catch up. You prime the pump through behavior. And then with repetition, the behavior itself becomes less aversive and eventually desirable. There's a concept in neuroscience known as reward prediction error. It describes what happens when the brain expects a certain reward and receives more or less than anticipated. If you want to train your brain to love hard work, occasionally reduce the extrinsic rewards associated with it. This may seem counterintuitive, but it's powerful. When you disconnect the task from the external outcome, you allow the internal reward system to dominate. You teach the brain that the process is the prize. And over time, the system stops needing constant validation. It begins to generate its own reinforcement loop. The most elite performers in any domain have mastered this. They've trained themselves to find satisfaction in the act of striving, in the daily repetition, in the pursuit itself. They may still care about the outcome, of course, but the outcome is not what gets them up in the morning. It's the process, the chance to challenge themselves, to improve, to express their potential, that fuels their work. This isn't just motivational fluff, it's deeply biological. The brain is a prediction machine. If it learns that effort reliably produces a chemical payoff, not just through success, but through the effort itself, it will start to crave effort. It will initiate work more readily, it will resist distractions more fiercely, and it will sustain output for longer. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. Neural circuits don't remap themselves after a single experience, but they do respond to repetition, consistency, and emotion. If you can inject meaning into your effort, if you can link the strain to something personally valuable, to your identity, to your mission, then the emotional component amplifies the learning. Your brain encodes not just the behavior, but the value of the behavior. And once value is associated with effort, hard work becomes less of a chore and more of a calling. This is why goals matter, but not for the reason most people think. Goals are important not just because they give you something to aim for, but because they give meaning to the effort you exert in their direction. Without that anchor, effort feels random. With it, effort feels like progress. And progress, even when invisible to others, is deeply motivating to the brain. One last piece: social influence. Human brains are wired for social learning. If you surround yourself with people who value effort, who celebrate discipline, who find pride in the process, your own brain begins to mirror that. Mirror neurons encode the behavior and emotional state of those around us. This is not metaphor, it's physiology. Spend time with people who love hard work, and your own affinity for it will grow. Not through willpower, but through biology. So the next time you feel resistance to a task, whether it's a workout, a study session, or a difficult conversation, pause. Recognize that this resistance is not a signal. It's a signal that you're entering the zone where real change happens. Embrace that, lean in. Tell yourself this effort is where the reward lies, and trust that your brain will catch up. Because ultimately loving hard work is not a personality trait, it's a trained response. It's a biological adaptation to a chosen mindset. And once that adaptation takes hold, there is no limit to how far you can go. Not because it gets easier, but because you get stronger. And because your brain, now aligned with your purpose, has learned to love the climb just as much as the view from the top. As you begin this transformation, one of the most powerful tools at your disposal is deliberate exposure to challenge. This does not mean plunging yourself into chaos, but rather intentionally placing yourself in conditions that require effort just beyond your current capacity. This approach is grounded in the principle of hormesis, a biological phenomenon where low doses of stressors stimulate adaptive improvements. When you deliberately engage with challenging tasks, your nervous system doesn't just cope, it upgrades. It develops greater resilience, sharper focus, and stronger circuits for persistence. Every time you repeat this cycle, challenge, effort, small success, or recovery, you're essentially casting a vote in the direction of your future identity. These experiences become embedded not just in memory, but in neural structure. Synaptic connections are strengthened, myelin sheaths around neurons are thickened, and the architecture of your brain changes to reflect your choices. This is not metaphor, this is measurable. Neuroplasticity is not a mysterious force, it's a physical, observable process. The more frequently you activate the pathways associated with perseverance, the more dominant those pathways become. You are quite literally sculpting a brain that prefers effort over ease. You can accelerate this by paying attention to your emotional responses. Emotions are chemical signatures that accompany experience. They tag certain events as meaningful and mark them for retention. When you push through resistance and then reward yourself, not necessarily with something external, but with reflection, with a brief moment of pride, or even with something as simple as saying to yourself, "This is who I am now," you link positive effect to effort. Over time, these emotional reinforcements hardwire the connection. Effort becomes tied not to dread, but to self-respect, and that shift is profound. Another powerful dimension to training your brain to love hard work is harnessing the role of anticipation. Anticipation is a state that primes the dopamine system. When you expect effort to lead somewhere meaningful, even if it's far in the future, your brain becomes more willing to invest energy in the present. This is why vision matters. When you hold a mental image, not just of the goal, but of the person you're becoming through the pursuit of the goal, that image acts like a magnet. It draws behavior toward it. Visualizing the process, not just the outcome, but the practice, the grit, the daily fight, creates an emotional bridge between now and later. And when the emotional tone of that visualization is one of purpose and identity, your system gets on board. There's also something to be said for breaking up the illusion of motivation as constant fire. You don't need to feel inspired to engage in hard work. In fact, the most resilient individuals often report that they feel neutral most of the time, not euphoric, not driven by massive waves of emotion, but centered, calm, and committed. This baseline state is something you can cultivate. Through practices like breathwork, cold exposure, or focused attention training, you can bring your nervous system into a regulated state more easily. That regulation, in turn, makes it easier to lean into work. Because if your system is calm, then challenge is not interpreted as danger, it's interpreted as opportunity. And there is deep wisdom in adopting the mindset of the practitioner rather than the performer. A performer is obsessed with outcome, how others will evaluate the result. A practitioner, however, is obsessed with the craft, the technique, the integrity of the process, the details that others might never notice, but that signal personal mastery. When you see yourself as someone who practices hard work, who refines their relationship with difficulty, then even failure becomes a form of success. Because failure within the context of practice is data. It shows you where to aim your attention next. In this context, mistakes are no longer threats to identity, they're requirements for growth. And the more comfortable you become with errors, not in the sense of being careless, but in the sense of accepting that improvement requires feedback, the more liberated you are to pursue difficult work without hesitation. You're not afraid of failing because you've decoupled your self-worth from the outcome. What matters is the process. What matters is showing up. And showing up is something you can design into your life. There is immense power in ritual, in consistent, repeatable sequences that initiate action. These rituals don't need to be elaborate. A specific place you sit to begin work. A particular way you breathe before lifting. A phrase you say to yourself before entering a hard conversation. These signals act as neural primers. They tell the brain, this is the context in which we exert effort. And over time, the association between the ritual and the work strengthens. Eventually, the ritual becomes a doorway, a reliable way to transition from inertia into action. The importance of state transitions cannot be overstated. One of the challenges with hard work is that it often requires shifting from one brain state to another, from comfort to alertness, from rest to engagement, from contemplation to execution. If you build conscious mechanisms for those transitions, whether through movement, breath, hydration, light exposure, or mental framing, you reduce the friction of initiation. And once work has begun, the probability of continuing rises dramatically. Momentum becomes an ally. You can also leverage physiological tools to sharpen your ability to stay in the zone. Visual focus, particularly narrowing your field of vision, is one way to trigger the attentional networks in the brain. When you deliberately focus your eyes on a specific point or area, you activate circuits that suppress background noise and reduce internal distraction. This isn't just helpful, it's transformative. Because so much of what derails hard work is not difficulty, but fragmentation. When your attention is scattered, effort feels heavier. When it's unified, effort flows. This is why environmental design matters. Create spaces that support focus, that reduce sensory clutter, that signal the brain here. We go deep. The brain responds powerfully to environmental cues. If you associate certain spaces with deep work, your brain will begin to prepare itself automatically when you enter them. Likewise, if you associate your phone or your social media feed with constant novelty and low effort gratification, those associations will undermine your ability to sustain attention elsewhere. You don't need to eliminate these sources of distraction entirely, but you do need to be intentional about when and how you engage with them. Otherwise, the short-term dopamine spikes they provide will outcompete the slower, more meaningful dopamine that comes from sustained effort. You can think of your dopamine system like a budget. There's only so much motivation currency available at a given time. Spend it on cheap thrills, and you'll have less for deep work. Spend it on challenges, and the system adapts. It becomes more efficient. It recalibrates what feels rewarding. And this recalibration is the essence of training your brain to love hard work. You're not just pushing yourself harder. You're changing what hard means. You're changing how it feels. You're also changing who you are. Because identity is not static. It's not something you discover once and for all. It's built through repeated behavior. Every time you choose effort over avoidance, you reinforce the idea, I am someone who does hard things. And the more often you act from that identity, the stronger it becomes. Eventually, it becomes the default. You no longer have to psych yourself up because your nervous system now expects that you will show up. This expectation becomes a form of internal accountability. This also helps with a common issue, the plateau. Everyone reaches points in their development where progress slows or seems to stall. What separates those who keep going from those who quit is often not talent, but tolerance. Tolerance for boredom, for repetition, for imperceptible gains. When you train your brain to love hard work, you're building a system that doesn't depend on constant novelty. You're building the ability to fall in love with iteration. And it's iteration, not inspiration, that builds excellence. There is also something deeply grounding in embracing effort as a gift. Most of the time, we see effort as the price we pay to get what we want. But what if effort is itself the reward? What if the ability to choose struggle, to lean into resistance is a form of freedom? Most of the time, we try to engineer ease. We look for ways to reduce friction, to make everything smoother. But real fulfillment rarely comes from the path of least resistance. It comes from rising to the challenge, it's difficult, from stretching yourself further than you thought possible. And to do that consistently, you need a nervous system that supports it, a brain that doesn't recoil from effort, but craves it. This transformation is available to anyone. It's not reserved for elite athletes, Navy SEALs, or high-level performers. It's available to the student struggling through a dense textbook, to the parent juggling work and care, to the entrepreneur facing rejection after rejection, to anyone who chooses, again and again, to walk toward what's difficult, not because they enjoy pain, but because they recognize what lies on the other side. Not just achievement, but transformation. Not just results, but identity. And there's one more layer, perhaps the deepest one. When you train your brain to love hard work, you are reclaiming agency. You are asserting that your life is not determined by inherited traits or fleeting motivation. You are saying, I am not at the mercy of how I feel in any given moment. I can shape my responses. I can rewire my instincts. I can choose who I become. That is power, not the power to control the world, but the power to control how you meet it. And in that space, the space between resistance and response, you find the kind of freedom that no one can give you and no one can take away. The freedom to strive, the freedom to grow, the freedom to work hard, not because you have to, but because you've learned to love it. The repetition of deliberate effort over time yields something few people understand deeply. Behavioral momentum. Behavioral momentum is a phenomenon where the probability of continuing a behavior increases simply because it has already been initiated and sustained. It is the cognitive and emotional residue of consistent action. When you commit to engaging in hard work daily, regardless of mood, convenience, or external validation, your brain doesn't just remember the work, it encodes the fact that you are the type of person who persists. The repetition becomes proof. This is how people build identities around discipline, and once that identity is internalized, the energy needed to begin and continue effort decreases. You are no longer negotiating with yourself. You are acting in accordance with who you believe you are. This is also why stacking wins matters, even small ones. Each time you follow through on a difficult task, your brain logs that action. Dopamine is released not just for huge accomplishments, but for every action that aligns with your goals and perceived identity. These micro rewards, accumulated over days and weeks, start to carry real neurological weight. Your system becomes more sensitive to the chemical cues that say, this is good, this is growth, this is forward. That accumulation of positive reinforcement around effort allows you to face increasing challenge without as much inner conflict. It's not that the work becomes less physically demanding, it's that it becomes less psychologically exhausting. This capacity to override internal resistance is also directly tied to the function of the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, a brain region heavily involved in persistence, conflict monitoring, and the willingness to continue exerting control in the face of challenge. Activity in this area increases when people continue trying despite setbacks. Importantly, this region is trainable. People who frequently engage in tasks that push their limits, that test their ability to stay the course without immediate reward, develop more robust function here. The effect is circular. More persistence leads to stronger circuits for persistence, which makes further persistence more likely. So, hard work isn't just about muscular willpower. It's not just about white-knuckling your way through discomfort. It's about recruiting and reinforcing systems in the brain that are biologically designed to sustain effort when paired with meaningful context and intentional reward mechanisms. When you understand this, you stop viewing difficulty as an obstacle and begin to see it as an opportunity to exercise, quite literally, the systems that enable long-term success. What this implies is that the conditions under which you approach hard work are just as important as the work itself. Start with intention. When you know why you're doing something, even if the immediate payoff isn't clear, your brain finds a framework within which to operate. Purpose amplifies persistence. And this doesn't require a grand existential mission, though that can help. It can be as simple as, I do this to prove to myself that I can, or this is how I build mental resilience. Clarity of intention strengthens the association between effort and value, and your dopamine system becomes attuned not to the result, but to the process of integrity. You can also take advantage of behavioral anchoring. This involves linking effort-based behaviors to already established habits or rhythms in your day. For instance, if you already have a morning routine, layer in 10 minutes of focused deep work before checking your phone. If you always eat lunch around the same time, use the half hour before it as a no-interruption grind session. By anchoring high-effort behaviors to predictable patterns, you reduce the decision fatigue that often derails hard work. Over time, the effort becomes part of the rhythm, and the brain comes to expect it. Even more powerful is when you begin to seek out effort. This happens when the sensation of exertion itself becomes pleasurable, not because it's easy, but because your nervous system has learned to interpret that strain as progress. We see this frequently in elite athletes, musicians, scientists, and entrepreneurs. They don't just tolerate the grind, they crave it. Their systems are so well tuned to the rhythm of high output and high focus that ease actually creates discomfort. They feel out of sync when they're not striving. And the good news is this state is replicable. It's not reserved for those at the top of their fields. It's a byproduct of repetition, intensity, and internal reward mechanisms that have been shaped intentionally over time. Another critical but often overlooked factor in learning to love hard work is emotional regulation. The ability to keep your autonomic nervous system in a regulated state while engaging in high-effort tasks is what allows you to stay present and calm under pressure. This doesn't mean being emotionless. It means recognizing emotional arousal for what it is and not letting it hijack your behavior. Techniques like nasal breathing, exhalation-focused breathing, visual anchoring, and somatic scanning can downregulate a stress response in real time. This gives you agency. It lets you re-enter focus without getting swept away by frustration or self-doubt. It's also important to understand that effort fatigue is not just physical or mental. It can be biochemical. Nutrient depletion, poor sleep, excessive blue light exposure, and misaligned circadian rhythms all chip away at your system's ability to engage fully. That's why optimizing your baseline matters. Sleep, sunlight exposure early in the day, hydration, and exercise form the foundation. If your physiology is underpowered, no amount of motivational hype will substitute. Your body and brain need to be resourced properly to support the neurochemical cascades involved in effort and reward. Once that foundation is in place, you can begin to implement what might be the most transformative aspect of training your brain to love hard work: deliberate constraint. Constraint means limiting options. When you eliminate the possibility of escape, when the only path forward is through the work, your system adapts. This doesn't mean punishing yourself or removing all joy. It means removing the mental negotiation. The more choices you have in the moment of potential effort, should I do this now or later? Should I take a break or push through? The more energy you expend managing your own indecision. But when the path is fixed, this is what I do at this time every day, no questions. That energy is conserved for the task, and the brain rewards consistency. Repetition in a constrained context produces adaptation. You become someone who simply works, not through force, but through design. This principle is well demonstrated in environments that demand high output over long durations. Military training, athletic camps, writing residencies, all of them impose constraints: limited time, limited space, clear rules. Why? Because these conditions reduce uncertainty, which reduces distraction, which allows focus to emerge naturally. You can replicate this for yourself. Decide in advance when and where you will work. Remove competing variables. The structure itself becomes a form of freedom to fully engage. Over time, this leads to what researchers call effort-related choice behavior. The tendency to choose high-effort actions over low-effort ones, even when the reward is equal or uncertain. This shift is enormous. When your brain begins to prefer effort, not because it's the fastest path to gratification, but because it is inherently satisfying, you unlock a new level of capacity. Work becomes not something you do to get a break later. Work becomes the center of gravity, the default, the place where you feel most alive. And this is where joy can enter the equation in a new way. There is a type of joy that is only accessible on the other side of challenge. It's not amusement or distraction. It's not the high of things. It's a deep cellular level sense of congruence, a feeling that your actions are in alignment with your potential, that you are doing what your nervous system was designed to do. Exert, adapt, evolve. This joy cannot be purchased or faked. It must be earned. And the only currency accepted is effort. So the task ultimately is not to find a shortcut, not to hack your way out of struggle. The task is to learn to value struggle, to welcome it, to recognize it as the raw material of greatness. Because when you rewire your brain to find satisfaction in effort itself, not as a means to an end, but as the end, you create the conditions for limitless growth, and that is not just a psychological achievement. It's a biological revolution. When you begin to experience this internal shift, when your system recognizes exertion not as threat, but as signal, it alters your baseline perception of effort. You no longer view it through the narrow lens of how hard is this, but rather, what is this making me become? This shift in interpretive framework fundamentally alters how the brain processes challenge. The insular cortex, which plays a central role in interoception and how we register discomfort, begins to relay a different kind of message. Instead of amplifying the sensation of strain as a reason to stop, it starts flagging it as a marker of significance. This matters, keep going. This matters, adapt. And that adaptation doesn't just manifest in the body, but in perception. The work itself becomes meaningful because the feedback from your own physiology begins to signal it as such. At this point, hard work becomes something more than just a pathway to a result. It becomes a lived experience of self-alignment. One of the greatest predictors of psychological health is the feeling that your actions are congruent with your values. When you train your brain to pursue effort willingly, to find satisfaction in the process of becoming through doing, you eliminate the dissonance that corrodes internal stability. You are no longer caught between what you wish you were doing and what you're actually doing. You are no longer fantasizing about a version of yourself you hope to someday become. You are being that person in real time through the act of working. This internal coherence generates momentum of a new kind. It's not the frantic sprint of early ambition, but the steady, cumulative force of deeply rooted drive. And from a biological perspective, this makes sense. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning, goal maintenance, and inhibitory control, becomes more efficient when aligned with consistent action. Neural circuits strengthen. Decision pathways get pruned and streamlined. You reduce the cost of switching between intent and execution. In essence, your brain gets better at being you, at being the version of you who works hard as a matter of habit, not willpower. There's something else that emerges here, and it's often ignored: emotional buoyancy. Many people associate hard work with grim determination, with stoicism stripped of any sense of joy. But once the brain associates effort with internal reward, once dopamine, serotonin, and endogenous opioids are released in the context of hard pursuit rather than outcome, then effort itself can lift mood. People often chase dopamine through novelty, but novelty is unreliable. Novelty fades. Effort, on the other hand, is renewable. There is always more to give, always more to refine, and thus always more reward to unlock, not through chasing, but through returning consistently to the work. This is where routine becomes sacred, not mundane, not boring, sacred. Because the routine becomes the container that holds your evolution. The specific time of day you train, the setup of your work desk, the way you prepare your mind before diving into something difficult, these become rituals of commitment. And rituals have deep roots in human neurobiology. They reduce uncertainty, they signal safety. And they cue readiness. When a ritual is enacted with conscious intent, it prepares the brain for what comes next. It acts as a mental switch, moving you out of distraction and into precision, out of passive mode and into deliberate pursuit. In this context, time transforms. Most people experience time as a pressure, a constraint. But when your brain is attuned to work and your nervous system is aligned with the rhythm of effort, time becomes a frame, not a threat. Within that frame, you pour your energy, your focus, your willingness to adapt. This generates what psychologists call temporal self-continuity, a felt sense that your present self is meaningfully connected to your future self, that the person you are becoming is being built moment by moment through action, and that continuity gives you a reason to care. It binds your attention to your goals. It keeps you from drifting into distraction because it reinforces the felt significance of now. Distraction, of course, is the enemy of effort. Not because it's evil, but because it's cheap. It hijacks your reward systems and trains them to prefer the path of least resistance. The more you indulge in impulsive, high-stimulation, low-friction behavior, scrolling, checking, toggling, the more you desensitize your dopamine pathways to slow-building reward. That means even if you sit down to do deep, meaningful work, your nervous system might not register it as important. It might not release the neurochemicals needed to sustain that work. Not because the work isn't worthy, but because your brain's tuning is off. That's why part of training your brain to love hard work involves creating an environment that protects deep focus. This isn't just about blocking noise or turning off notifications. It's about signaling to your entire physiology that you're entering a zone of meaning. That zone, once established, allows for what researchers call neural entrainment, a phenomenon where brain waves begin to synchronize with patterns of external rhythm and internal intent. When you work consistently in the same place at the same time with the same cues, your brain begins to prepare for that state automatically. Attention deepens more quickly. Distractions are filtered more efficiently, and the work begins to carry its own inertia. There's another dimension to this: social modeling. We are wired to imitate the emotional tone and behavioral patterns of those we observe frequently. This means your brain is not only shaped by your own behavior, but by the behavior of those around you. If your environment is saturated with people who treat effort as pain, who complain about struggle, who avoid discomfort at all costs, your mirror neurons will internalize that aversion. But if you surround yourself with those who treat effort as currency, who value growth over ease, your system learns to do the same. This is not motivational theory. It is evolutionary neurobiology we learn by watching. So be deliberate about what you watch and who you let close. Equally important is the language you use internally. The phrases you say to yourself when you encounter resistance are not neutral. They form cognitive scripts, repeating thought patterns that become automatic responses. If your internal monologue is laced with doubt, fatigue, or resentment when effort is required, your limbic system will associate hard work with threat. But if you prime yourself with language that normalizes struggle, that frames pain as part of progress, that reminds you of the why, your brain begins to adopt a different posture. It no longer flinches when effort is demanded. It leans in. And leaning in, when it becomes the norm, builds a profound kind of confidence, not based on talent or achievement, but on reliability. You begin to trust yourself. Because you've seen over and over again that you show up, that you don't flee the work, that you don't back down in the face of difficulty. This internal reliability creates what's known in psychology as self-efficacy, the belief that you can produce results through your own effort. High self-efficacy is one of the strongest predictors of resilience, motivation, and long-term goal attainment. And it's built not in moments of victory, but in moments of choice, when you choose to engage the hard thing again and again, even when no one is watching. Eventually, this builds a kind of energetic equilibrium. The highs and lows of motivation smooth out. You no longer chase spikes of inspiration or collapse under waves of doubt. You operate from a steady current, a regulated baseline from which effort flows naturally. This is the state that elite performers live in. Not perpetual hype, but quiet certainty. Not constant passion, but deep alignment, and you can build it. Not through secrets, not through hacks, but through the patient, structured repetition of showing up to the hard thing until it becomes who you are. The ability to love hard work is not a gift, not a trait bestowed on the lucky few. It's a system you train, a rhythm you build, a relationship with effort you cultivate deliberately over time. The circuits in your brain that resist discomfort can be rewired. The chemistry that once signaled avoidance can be redirected toward pursuit. And the identity you hold of who you are, what you're capable of, and what kind of challenges you willingly take on can be completely transformed through consistent, intentional action. If you train your brain to find value in strain, to seek progress in the process, and to extract meaning not from the result, but from the work itself, there's nothing, no goal, no path, no adversity that lies outside your reach. The work becomes the reward, the effort becomes the edge, and you slowly but permanently become the kind of person who doesn't just tolerate hard work, but thrives because of it.